أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. So welcome everyone to this talk that we're going to have organized by IMCV about LGBT and the impact that it has on our community. First of all, introductions. I'm not speaking in Indonesian because obviously we have an English speaker and my Indonesian isn't that great anyway. And just to introduce everyone to Brother Krayem, who's going to be giving the talk today. So Brother Ghaith is a former president of ICV. Right now he's the president of the Light Foundation based in the southeastern suburbs, an educational initiative to not only give Islamic education to Muslims, but also da'wah and clarifying some of the misconceptions that other people have about Islam as well. So he's going to give about a 20 minutes to half an hour chat about, lecture about LGBT and the impact it has on our community. If you don't know, my name's Alaric. I'm Wulan's son. I'm about to graduate as a doctor, and this is something that's pertinent in what I will do and doing now as a living as well. So that's probably why MCV asked me to MC this event. So thank you very much for that. Another thing before we begin is that before this lecture today, we did have a survey that we made about 67 people do from here, Westall and other places. And just to, I don't know if many of you did filled out that survey as well, but just some of the conclusions of this survey were saying that many of you know what LGBT is, so we don't have to clarify the definitions perhaps. And the consensus was it is against religious values, but and it's something that perhaps is concerning that the movement of LGBT is getting more prominent in our schools. So perhaps there's something that's much more concerning for parents and their children right now going through public schooling. Without further ado, apart from that, we're going to give the mic to Brother Ghaith, and hopefully he can clarify some issues here. Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum assalam. Jazakallahu khairan. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. As-salamu was-salatu ala Sayyidina Muhammadan wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'in. Jazakallahu khairan. Thank you for inviting me to come along today and just to share, I guess, some of my own thoughts on the whole LGBTI issue and just some, I guess, some points around how we as a community, but also individually, as individuals and parents, you know, respond to some of the issues which are coming up and which are going to continue to come up in the future. I'm giving my personal view here. So, as a former president of the ICV, I'm not talking on behalf of the ICV. The Islamic Council of Victoria has never put out a position on this issue. So nobody quote me as talking on behalf of the ICV. I am talking on behalf of my own group, the Light Foundation, though. So this is a position that we do take on this issue. LGBT. I'll talk for, I don't know. Sometimes I just talk and we'll see how long it goes for. But I'll talk for probably 30 minutes or thereabouts. Normally I like Q&A while I'm talking. This particular talk, though, I'm going to ask you to hold off your questions to the end, because it's one of those topics where I like to build up, you know. So I might answer some of your questions as we go through. There's a little bit of complexity to it. So, you know, we'll talk for 30, 40 minutes or whatever, and then we might have, you know, maybe about 20, 25 minutes, if we can, for a good discussion on some of the issues, inshallah. LGBTI, right? It seems like every few months we add another letter to that acronym. Lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, intersex, right? If we were going to talk about each one of those separately, we would need a lecture on each one of them from an Islamic perspective, because they are different and there are different theological basis for how we respond to them, right? We don't have the time today for me to talk about each one of them separately. So I'm going to be making general comments about homosexuality generally and same-sex attraction generally. The underlying principles apply across the board. But obviously somebody who identifies as intersex is not the same as somebody who identifies as lesbian or gay, right? But we don't have the time to go through the nuances of each. The underlying principles are the same. I describe this issue as one which our community gets a little bit schizophrenic about. Right? It's really important on one hand, not because we make it important, but because the society we live in is going to make it important, right? We can already see the increasing focus on this issue in the broader Australian society. We've got the whole debate around same-sex marriage. We've got the whole, debate around what's now referred to as gender fluidity. So the idea that people have not just the right, but in fact, it's almost like a positive obligation to explore their sexuality and one day choose to be one gender, the next day choose to be a different gender. That focus is going to become even greater. But from our perspective, as a community, we have far more important problems, in all honesty, than this one. Yeah? But we're going to be, this issue is going to be foisted on us. We're going to be forced to deal with this issue because it's one of those issues which the broader Western society uses to make themselves feel superior over people of faith, right? And when I talk about people of faith, it's not just Muslims here. It's all the Abrahamic faiths, so Christians, Jews, Muslims, all the orthodox Abrahamic faiths take the exact same position theologically on this issue, right? The difference is this, though. Within the Christian movement, within the Jewish movement, there are much more advanced groups within those faiths around the acceptance theologically of this issue. And so we are going to be seen more and more as the outlier. Why is it that Christians, why is it that the church accepts gay priests, but Muslims still refuse to accept homosexual imams, for example? We're going to be, this issue is going to be used against us more and more as we move forward. And we can already see what's happening in terms of school programs. Again, I think with some of the school programs, we've overreacted to some of them, right? We want to make sure that we don't lose genuine positive things around diversity and tolerance with programs which are promoting the normalisation of gender fluidity, yeah? And I'll talk a little bit more about that. I'm going to try and cover three different things. One, what's the Islamic position on this issue generally? So from a theological perspective, what does the Deen say about this issue? That's got to be our starting point. We need to be really firm on what the Deen says on this issue. I'll then just cover off a couple of the common arguments put forward by Western thinkers around why we should accept this lifestyle choice. And that's my language. Other people will say it's not a choice, but let's put that aside for the moment. And then the third thing is really just some nasiha for me, around how we should respond to this issue generally, to non-Muslims who live this particular lifestyle, but also to Muslims, right? Let's not bury our heads in the sand. There are Muslims who have these desires, these inclinations, right? And they fall into two camps. There are those who acknowledge the theological position, but still struggle with the nafs on this issue. And there are others who have abandoned the theological position and are living their life, as any other person in Western society would, because they've got freedom of choice and can do what they want, right? And I'll cover off both of those, inshallah. So from the religious position, what's the Deen say about these issues? I'm going to go back a few steps. Actually, let me contradict what I've just going to say. The real simple answer, it's haram, right? I'll talk through some of the dalil, the proofs for it in a moment. But the real simple answer, this is one of those things where there is no ikhtilaf, there is no dispute amongst the ulama. Same-sex attraction, same-sex relationships, homosexuality, call it what you will, in Islam is haram. It is haram to act on that desire. It is not haram to have the desire itself. It's a really important distinction we need to make. Islam does not judge us on what we think and what we feel. It judges on what we do. Yeah? So that the prohibition is in acting on that desire. And it becomes really important when we talk about how we deal with Muslims in particular who struggle with this issue. All right, I'll come back to the first a little bit more, but I want to take a few steps back. I want to just talk a little bit about our Aqidah, right? The things that we believe in, right? Because as Muslims living in a Western, or what is described as a Western liberal democratic society, we are often challenged by things which notionally seem right. Right? Western liberal democracies hold themselves up as being the arbiters and the protectors of freedom. And so when other cultures, other people with other values take positions which are counter to some of those positions, Western societies then challenge us as being, you know, oppressors and what have you. The starting point from my perspective is about Aqidah. What is it that we actually believe in? Because when push comes to shove, this particular issue around gender and gender fluidity, we're not going to win on a rational basis with a non-Muslim. Don't kid ourselves. We're not going to sit here and have a rational, we're not going to convince somebody on a rational basis that what Western societies have been leading up to for over 100 years is wrong, because our starting point is Iman, is faith. What we need to do is make sure we are firm on our position. And then we make da'wah, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the ultimate opener of those hearts and those doors, and He will guide those that He will, right? So our starting point is, what do we believe in? So there's some just important things I think I just want to go over from an Aqidah perspective. The first of all is our relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? You know, what do we teach our kids in madrasa, in Sunday school? You know, one of the first things we teach them is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala owes us nothing. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala owes us zero. There is nothing we will do that will benefit Allah in any way. There's nothing we won't do that will detract from Allah in any way, right? We owe Allah absolutely nothing. It's the reverse. Everything that we have, we owe to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Every drop of water He sends us, every grain of rice or wheat that we eat from is from His mercy and His generosity. He has no obligation to give it to us at all. And that forms the foundation of our relationship with our Creator, right? You know, the two most loved names to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala are what? Abdullah, the slave of Allah. You know, is the most loved name of the Rasul Sallam and of anybody. Why? Because it defines our relationship with our Creator, right? We are a slave to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You know, when are we closest to Allah? It's when our forehead is prostrating on the ground. So when we're at our lowest point in this dunya is when we're our closest to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's what we mean by submitting, right? We submit completely to Allah. But what are the implications of that submission? The implication of that submission is there are some things which we may not understand, which we just accept. And we say, Allahu A'lam, what the real reason behind it is. You know, I hear and see Muslims often trying to have arguments or discussions, debates about scientific evidence. You know what? Forget it. What we believe scientifically now is not what we believed scientifically 5 years ago or 10 years ago or 20 years ago. It's not going to be what we believe scientifically 5 years' time or 20 years' time. These issues are not scientific issues. These issues are social issues. These are issues about belief and our position in the cosmos and the universe. Don't get caught up in having to justify some things on a rational basis, because it changes. Even this issue of homosexuality, 30, 40 years ago, was seen as a mental health issue. It was an illness. Now, progress says, no, it's not, it's something else. Western science changes. It changes all the time. The position we always revert to is what does the deen say about it? Everything comes from the divine will. Nothing happens in this dunya except that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala willed it to happen. Right? That doesn't take away our choice. You know? Our fundamental belief is that what makes us different from the malaika, from the angels, and from the animals is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave us choice. Right? But nothing happens without His will. And we need to keep that in mind. So if somebody has those desires, right, then that's the way Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created them. That's the way Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made them. And there's a challenge there in how we respond to things that we see as being problems or tests or risks. And we'll come back to those, you know, in a moment. But the last, I guess, on this point is the status of the Quran itself. Right? It is a principle of our Aqidah that the Quran is the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? We believe that the Quran is the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Don't worry about, you know, the form and what have you. The Quran itself is the unaltered word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which means when we say Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah, Ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah, that's actually a shortcut to a much longer testification, which includes all the other things that we believe in. The oneness of Allah, the messenger, all the messengers, his books, the Quran being one of those books, and the fact that the Quran itself is the message of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, his angels. So we fundamentally believe in the angels, and that Jibreel alayhi salam, who can't do anything except through the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because angels don't have choice, right, revealed what Allah wanted him to reveal to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So we fundamentally believe that the Quran has come straight from the Creator. It's a big difference between, say, Islam and Christianity. The Bible, as it is today, is not the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The Bible, as it is today, wasn't even written at the time that Jesus alayhi salam was around. It was actually documented about 300 years after Jesus alayhi salam. And that Bible isn't even the Bible that we have in place today. So it's not an issue in the Christian doctrine for them to reinterpret some of that language. That's not open to us. This idea that Islam needs a reform is a nonsense from that perspective. There are some things in the Quran which are very clear, and we take them for what they are. Some of those things we understand why the Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has ordained them, some things we don't. There are other things which lend themselves to metaphorical meaning, and that's where we rely on the ulama. That's why we rely on 1400 years of scholarship to tell us what those things mean. This is not one of the latter. This is one of the former. This is one of those things which is categorically laid out in the deen, in the Quran, and that it's not open to ambiguity. All right. So the starting position is, you know, at the end of the day, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has said, this is haram. Right. And there's a whole range of reasons we can give up, and I'll talk about some of them a little bit later. But fundamentally, the Islamic position is that it's haram, and you can look into the ayat in the Quran. Obviously, there's the story of Nabi Lut and the people of Lut. It's fundamental there. It doesn't mean that people don't have these inclinations and act on these things, just as Muslims do other things which are haram, right? And I'll talk about some of those a little bit later. I want to talk about the fitrah. So this is to cover some of these issues around: is it nurture, are people born this way? Are we, is it society? Is it the environment that treats them this way? People who feel that they are in the wrong body. Now, you need to distinguish people's genuine feelings, emotions, desires from what the logical theological position is, right? So just because we say the deen says this doesn't mean we deny that somebody doesn't have those feelings, those emotions. They do. The challenge is in how we help them deal with those feelings. We know from an Islamic position that every soul, when it comes into this dunya, comes on a state of fitrah. What does that mean? It doesn't mean that every person is born a Muslim. There's a subtle difference here. It's not what the deen says. The hadith of the Rasul, which says every child is born in a state of fitrah until their parents make them a Christian or a Jew, right? Doesn't necessarily mean fitrah equates to being a Muslim. What it means is, we know in the Quran, Allah tells us, before creation, before anything was created, every single soul that would ever be born, ever brought into this world was brought before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala asked every single soul, do you know who I am? Yes, you are our Lord. There was a covenant given. Every soul, when it comes into this world, already knows who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is. And it has an inclination to please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? That's the most easiest way to explain the concept of fitrah. It's an inclination, if we put it in the right environment, to find the right way to please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which obviously from our perspective is Islam. So there's an inclination to follow the deen of Islam, because that's what would be pleasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But society changes that, right? You know, what parents do, what society does, impacts upon the soul as it comes through, and it changes. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala isn't going to create a soul that doesn't have the capacity to follow Islam. We know that. That's a fundamental part of our deen. That's what the fitrah is. It's the ability, it's the capacity to follow the deen, right? So we know our starting point is an ability to follow the deen. While we may have challenges, right? I just want to test everybody, right? Nobody should be sitting here thinking, you know, alhamdulillah, I haven't been tested. Everybody gets tested. Sometimes you're aware of the tests people have, and sometimes you're not aware. Sometimes the people who you think have the easiest life in the world, when they go home, have the hardest test that you can possibly imagine. I also want to test people. Those tests just come in different ways. Sometimes we are born different to others. People are born with disabilities as we see them, but that's how Allah created that individual. Everybody's created the way Allah intended for them to be created. Allah doesn't make mistakes, astaghfirullah. Everybody's created the way Allah intended for them to be created. It's our challenge in this life. Remember, this life is not the real life. That's to come. You know, this is a very short life. You know, it's a very short time. It's our challenge to deal with those tests Allah puts before us, to make sure that when our time comes in the hereafter, we've set ourselves up for success, right? That's the real challenge for us. So, you know, this idea that people don't have a choice about some of these issues, theologically, we don't accept. Everybody has a choice. Even if the only choice is that I won't act on the desire, right? That I can't change the desire, but I will not act on the desire. That is still a choice. And there are plenty of Muslims who do that. There are plenty of Muslims who do that. And it is hard. It is a really hard thing for people to challenge their nuts in that particular way, right? But they do, right? So, you know, they're just, I guess, some points from an Aqidah perspective that we need to keep in mind when we're talking about some of these issues. And I can go through these in a little bit more detail, and maybe some Q&As will promote that. I guess the last point on this is there's a growing movement of progressive Muslims, right? This is going to be an area which they will use because it's something which the West will respond to very well, right? So it's important for us to know what the Deen says so that we're not, you know, sucked in, if you like, by these notions of modernity and being progressives, which actually fundamentally take you out of the Deen, right? There are some things which are so universally accepted as part of the religion that believing that they are not part of the religion will take you out of the religion, right? Alcohol. You know, if somebody doesn't believe that alcohol is haram, if somebody doesn't believe eating pork is haram, if somebody doesn't believe it is fard to pray your 5 salah, right? If somebody doesn't believe in, I know this one might sound controversial, if somebody doesn't believe the hijab is a fard, right? It will take you out of the Deen, right? Now, you can have those beliefs and not do them, separate issue. There are plenty of people who accept that I've got to pray, but for whatever reason don't pray. That's a separate issue. There are plenty of people who accept that hijab is fard, but for whatever reason can't put the hijab on. That's a separate issue completely, right? And we don't judge people, you know, because of those things, right? But there are fundamental things that we believe in, and one of those is that the only valid intimate relationship exists between a man and a woman in a valid recognized marriage, which automatically excludes same-sex relationships and all of those things. I'll talk towards the end though, but it also automatically excludes things like fornication, for example, and relationships outside of marriage and boyfriends and girlfriends, and yet we ostracize Muslims who struggle with their desires in this space, but we turn a blind eye to people on this side of the camp. And this is where our own hypocrisy comes into play. And I'll come back to that, you know, towards the end, inshallah. I was going to talk a little bit more about acting on desires, but I think I've spoken enough about we've got to, you know, put that aside. Let's talk then about a couple of things that are often put as arguments around why we don't have a right to oppose this or why we should be accepting this. The first one is, you know, use your language, but it's generally around the fact that society can't make moral judgments about what individuals do in their own home, right? In a Western liberal democracy, we often hear this, you know, the individual has the right to do what they want, and, you know, behind closed doors, and it's nobody else's business what they do. Two things on that point. One, it's a nonsense. Western societies do not do that. They say they do that, but they don't do that, and we'll go through some of those examples. And where they do it, they don't do it consistently. Right? The classic example. Let's take this issue. There's this huge push for the acceptance and the normalisation of gender fluidity, same-sex relationships. And yet, what is the reaction of Western societies when we raise the issue of polygamy? How do you reconcile a society that says people have the right to do what they want in their own home without interference, as long as it doesn't harm someone, and that's one of the bases on which they say same-sex relationships should be accepted, and yet there is this almost neurotic response to the issue of polygamy itself, right? So they're not consistent by any stretch of the imagination. But even this notion of not making moral judgments about what people do is a nonsense. So Western society does it all the time, right? Western society does it all the time. You know, you can't do just what you want in your own home. There are laws all over the place that prohibit what you do. The question is, what are the things that society should or shouldn't be worried about? Or what are the things that society should or shouldn't make laws or rules about, right? Western societies are down this road of individualism. You know? Fundamentally, from an Islamic perspective, we take two positions. From the perspective of our ibadah, our worship, ours is an individual religion, much more than any other religion. I don't need anybody else to intercede between me and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Other than Rasul on the Day of Judgment, nobody's going to intercede for me, right? It's between me and my Creator. I don't need to come to a mosque to pray. Put aside the issue of, you know, Jum'ah being fard, right? But, you know, I don't need the permission of a priest or an imam. If I want to make tawbah, that's between me and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I do it in the privacy of my own home. I don't need somebody else to intervene. Right? Islam is a very individual relationship when it comes to worship. When it comes to our muamalat, our actions, the ummah itself, Islam says no. Islam says the needs of the ummah are greater than the needs of the individual. And so Islam says, at an individual level, you need to give some things up because it's for the greater good of the whole. Alcohol is a classic one, right? You know, yes, not everybody is going to get drunk if they drink alcohol, right? But the harms that come from alcohol are such that Allah says no to everybody because the community is better off that way. Gambling is the same. Riba is the same, right? Western societies, though, don't take that approach. They promote this idea that that civilization equates to individual freedom, right? But in reality, there's no such thing. That's anarchy, right? Western societies put limits on individual freedom all the time. Let's look at the whole debate about dress. You know, so on one hand, we have Western societies that promote this idea that you should be able to do what you want, except Muslim women, you can't dress the way you want. Where's the logic in this? Right? So don't accept this argument that says people have the right to do whatever they want without interference if they're not harming anybody. Because Western societies don't apply it. Right? Society makes judgments all the time about what people can and can't do. The base upon which we make those judgments is the deen. The base upon which Western societies make those judgments changes every single day. It depends on the popularity of politicians. It depends on what they know is going to get them votes. It depends on what will sell a newspaper, right? So you tell me which is the better position for a society to have. One that has a strong foundation and knows why it takes the positions it does, or one where every single day that position is going to change. And when we come to this issue of sexuality and gender, we can see where the trend is going, right? We can see where the trend is going. Right? So, you know, put aside, and I'm not saying that homosexuality or same-sex attraction leads to other things in terms of individual behaviour, but the societal approach to morality heads a particular path, right? So things which were not acceptable to be spoken about 10, 15, 20 years ago, 40 years ago, which are now commonly accepted, shift the goal points, shift the benchmark. We are in a position now where, right now, in Europe, there is real discussions taking place about legalising incest. Stuck for a lot, right? About legalising incest. You know, so it started in Germany about 18 months ago. It's happening in Norway right now, and it's becoming more of a discussion in Britain, this issue of incest, right? This notion that adults can make their own choices about certain about these matters, right? Now, even 5 years ago, Western society itself would have been abhorred by this notion that incest would be acceptable, right? But it's changing, right? You know, because where is the limit? What's your barometer? What is it that you judge things on? Right? You know, the family unit is a fundamental part of the health of the ummah, right? And from a Islamic perspective, everything revolves around the family and the notion of family as it grows. Until we get to the hadith of Rasulullah that says the ummah is like one body. When one part gets injured, the whole body hurts. That's what it is. You know, that's the whole notion of being connected, right? The way you control people is by giving them the illusion that they're free. And that's what Western societies do. They give people the illusion that they're free. But what do they end up doing is they get chained by their desires. Islam says no. Islam says freedom is by fighting your nafs, fighting your desires so that you are not governed by your desires. Right? Islam says freedom comes from not being governed by your desires, being able to do things in accordance with the laws of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which actually go counter to your own nafs. So when we talk about the jihad of the nafs, you know, we love to talk about, you know, jihad isn't going out and fighting, it's jihad of the nafs. That's what jihad of the nafs is. Jihad of the nafs is fighting your desires. It's not just, you know, being out there and saying, I'm a Muslim. It's fighting your desires, which naturally, you know, which have an inclination to accept some of the things that happen around them, right? So that's a fundamental difference. So let's not accept this idea that Western societies put out there that they don't make moral judgments, they don't go and intervene, because they do, right? We say, yeah, we should, and the purpose of it should be based on divine revelation, not some man-made notions of what is or isn't moral. This issue, the other one is, well, there's no harm, right? There's no harm in it. You know, why people have a right to be able to be happy. You know, it doesn't hurt anybody else. Fundamentally, from our perspective, though, you know, where does happiness come from an Islamic perspective, right? Islamically, happiness for us doesn't come from these sorts of ideas, right? There's a phrase which is repeatedly used in the Quran. Allah uses this terminology a number of times. Radiyallahu anhum wa radu an. Right? Allah is pleased with them and they are pleased with Him. Right? So how do we please Allah? Right? It's very simple. That one's really easy. You please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by doing the things that He says to do and keeping away from things He says to keep away from. But this notion about us being pleased with Allah sort of runs a little bit counterintuitively to what I said up front about us being the slaves and we have no, you know, we have no rights over Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? Us being pleased with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is accepting what He gives us and being content with that and saying alhamdulillah. That's us being pleased with Allah. It's not us questioning. Whatever happens, we say alhamdulillah and we accept. And we have genuine acceptance, right? We often translate sabr as patience. Right? Patience is a part of sabr, but it's not quite the same. Right? for me, sabr isn't just being patient with your situation. It's actually accepting that this is going to be my situation. That doesn't stop you. It doesn't stop you making dua to Allah subhanahu to change your situation. But if this is it, then alhamdulillah, I'm content with that. Right? That's being pleased with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Our happiness doesn't come in this life. Our happiness comes in the next. Right? And it's a hard thing to keep, in the back of our mind. We get caught up with the day-to-day dunya of, the rat races as we refer to in Western societies. And we forget that this is not even a drop in the ocean in terms of our existence. On average, we're going to live in this life for whatever it is now. It gets a bit longer. It's probably 80, 85 years on average now. Allah A'lam, whatever it is. And then we're going to spend eternity in the next life. Right? We're going to spend eternity in the next life. So what's happening is for us, in the West, they have this saying, you only live life once, so live it to the fullest. Right? As people have heard of that expression. So write up your bucket list, do everything you want in this life. You're going to be dead soon. Our saying is no. We will only die once. So we live life so that our death is the best it can be. Right? So we don't do things. We stop ourselves from doing things which would give us immediate satisfaction and pleasure in this life to safeguard our akhirah. Right? And our dealings in terms of gender interactions and intimacy and sexual relationships is one of those things. Right? We accept that there is a sanctity to this relationship between a man and woman which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has ordained for us. Right? And there are plenty of people who have desires for opposite gender, but they can't exercise all those desires because they accept the only way you do it is within the marriage. Right? Those people have to challenge themselves all the time. No, I'm not going to go have 10 wives. I'm not going to say 3 or 4 wives. I'm not going to have 10 wives. I'm not going to have a boyfriend or a girlfriend. Right? I'm not going to go live with someone, right, without being married because it's haram. Right? I'm going to dampen those desires. There are some people that Allah has written will never be married. There are plenty. We all know people who haven't been married and who won't get married. Allah says to those people, sorry, you cannot have sexual relationships. Are they any different to somebody who has a desire for somebody who Allah says it's haram for you to exercise that desire? There is no difference from an Islamic perspective. That person is just as challenged in managing their desires as somebody who's attracted to a person of the same sex. Right? So we don't look at this because it's just about same sex. We look at this from the perspective of Allah has told us this is the valid relationship. There is a purpose behind this. There's a hikmah. Sometimes we know that, sometimes we don't know what that hikmah is. Anything else is haram, right? So same-sex attraction is no different to somebody who is single, not married, and will never get married. It's no different to somebody who has a desire that their valid partner cannot satisfy. This is often a problem in marriages, where one partner's libido is much stronger than another one's. It doesn't give the person the right to then go out and satisfy themselves with somebody else and stuff for the Lord. No. You control your desires. That's what Islam says. So happiness for us isn't about satisfying those desires. Happiness for us is about doing the things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says we need to do to safeguard our akhirah. Just trying to think of what else. I might just skip a couple of those points. All right, so let's turn our mind now to our situation here in Australia. So how do we respond to people who have these inclinations, to homosexuality, same-sex attraction, whatever it may be? And how do we respond to societal pressure in this space? Let's talk about how we deal with non-Muslims first. And we often find this difficult because at an individual level, put aside the issue of people being attracted to someone same sex, they're no different to anybody else. There's nothing inherently wrong with somebody just because of that. They don't suddenly grow horns out of the top of their head because of this issue. Yeah, you know, look, I'm sure there are people here who were born and bred in this country. I came as a 3-year-old. I've only ever lived in this country. You know, I've always known homosexual people. Somebody who, you know, I would call some of my closest friends in terms of my day-to-day interactions, people in this space. When you put aside everything other than the issue of their sexual preference. So we've got to keep things in balance. When I'm dealing with non-Muslims, before I worry about their sexual preference, my very first worry though, if I genuinely care about someone, isn't their sexual preference, it's their akhirah. When they're in the grave, are the angels going to ask them, what was your sexual preference? Is that one of the 3 questions we get asked? No, it's not. Yes. What was your deen? Who was your Lord and who was your prophet? Let's worry about their deen first before we get caught up about their sexual preference, right? Let's worry about whether we can open their hearts to Islam before we worry about, you know, trying to convince them that homosexuality is right or not, right? Because they're not even going to get to be judged about their homosexuality if we don't deal with the issue of their faith, right? You know, often people say Islam is a religion of peace. Yeah, I change that slightly. My view is Islam is a religion of mercy and justice. You can't have peace without justice, right? I think it's a nonsense to expect people to be peaceful if they're being oppressed, right? Islam is not a religion of turn the other cheek forever, like Christianity is, right? Islam is about justice and mercy, right? And we have forgotten, I think, this notion of mercy, of rahmah, in our dealings with people. Yeah, there's so many examples through the seerah of the Prophet ﷺ and his way of dealing with people with rahmah and with mercy. And we know that Allah told us that He sent the Prophet as what? As a mercy to all of mankind, not to us. The Prophet was sent as a mercy to all of mankind. If he was sent as a mercy to all of mankind, the fundamental starting point for us in our dealings with non-Muslims is from a position of rahmah, from mercy. You're not going to convince somebody of the beauty of Islam when you're smacking them around the head, you know, verbally, right? That's not how Islam spread, right? So our fundamental starting point in our dealings with any non-Muslim is one that we want to be merciful. We want to show Islam in the light that it truly is. That's a reflection of us and our behaviour. So don't sit there and have an argument about their sexual preference as your starting point. Obviously, if somebody says, what is the Islamic view about this issue, then we're very clear. Islam says it's haram. That's it. We don't shy away from that, right? But if you work with somebody who has one of these desires or fits one of these categories, or you know somebody, they're a neighbour, don't make this your starting point. It shouldn't be your starting point. It's no worse than drinking, no worse than gambling, no worse than fornication. None of them are as bad as disbelief. Disbelief when dealing with non-Muslim is our starting point. So let's work on changing their disbelief. And we make dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that if He does guide them to Islam, that He also then makes it easy for them to deal with these other issues that they will need to deal with. Yeah, that's from a non-Muslim perspective, you know, generally. I'll come back and talk about the school environment because children are funny beasts sometimes. What about Muslims? Right? Muslims fall into 2 categories with this issue. There are those, and again, let's not kid ourselves. This issue has been around forever. This is not a new issue. Right? What is new though is this trend to use gender and sexual preference as an identifier, right? Within the Islamic tradition, Islam doesn't use sexual preference as an identifier. Right? You're male, you're female. End of story. That's it. You might be a male who's attracted to other males. Doesn't change your fundamental nature as a man. You might be a woman who's attracted to other women. Doesn't change you being a woman. Right? Islam doesn't have a third option. Right? Islam doesn't identify people as homosexual or as bisexual. It identifies people as male and female. From that, there are there are issues, or not issues, there are rights and obligations that flow from those roles which are assigned by the divine creator around being a male or a female, right? Your sexual preference is a completely separate issue in terms of your gender and your identity in that sense. So we have Muslims who now do not accept that homosexuality, same-sex attraction, all of those other matters, who don't accept that those things are haram in the deen, right? We have them, and that number is growing, unfortunately, right? My view, and I would urge everybody to check with your own mashayikh, with your own ulama, my view is somebody who believes that it is acceptable within the deen is outside the deen of Islam. That is a fundamental part of the deen, and disbelief in it is kufr, takes you outside the fold. It's in the same category as believing that salah isn't obligatory. It's the same category as believing alcohol isn't haram, right? And you deal with those people no differently as that you would deal with non-Muslims. You don't deal with them any worse than you deal with non-Muslims, right? Because the fundamental issue is still their disbelief, right? We reach out to them with mercy, but if they are open and antagonistic in their approach to this issue, my advice is we don't engage with them on this issue in the context that we live in this society, right? There is no benefit to us as a minority in this society in challenging people who self-identify as Muslims on this particular issue, right? We leave them up to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? We don't engage. They want to have the argument about it. We say, no, we disagree, and you can have that argument with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on the day of judgment, right? It's a challenge if there are people within your family who are like this, yeah? And this is where you need to weigh up, you know, some of the obligations we have as Muslims. One of our obligations is to maintain the ties of family, yeah? And so my approach to this is you maintain the ties of family to the minimum extent that you think you have to meet that obligation without bringing this sort of thing into your home, right? So if somebody is openly expressing their sexual preference, their lifestyle, my view is I would not bring that into my house. Doesn't mean I cut the person off, right? I'll give it, you know, if they're a cousin, or if they're God forbid, if it was a brother or a nephew or a niece, I wouldn't cut them off. I would maintain the connection, because you never know. Allah in 6 months' time, 12 months' time, may guide them back, right? We never give up on someone, right? What our final state is on our death is Allahu A'lam, we don't know, right? So we never give up. So we maintain that tie. But I'm not going to allow my children, for example, to socialise with them, because I believe that the environment fundamentally impacts the mind, particularly of growing children. And we know the hadith. Hadith tells us, you are the people who you associate with. So if you want to be a person of faith, then you associate with people of faith. All right. What about Muslims who accept that it's haram and are still challenged by it? I think we do this group a huge disservice. Right? I really do. I think we owe this group a lot more than what we currently do, because of this issue and because of the stigma that we have with this issue of same-sex attraction. We isolate people like this, right? We ignore them, we push them away. Imagine how hard it would be for somebody who accepts that it's wrong, but still has those feelings, those emotions, those thoughts. How hard would it be for someone like that to come to, say, somebody in a musalla or a masjid and ask for help? It would be so hard. It would be so hard. And we make their life so much harder. And we shouldn't kid ourselves that there hasn't been cases of suicide because people like that haven't been able to handle the pressure and knowing how to deal with those situations. We as a community need to respond much better to Muslims who believe and have held on to their iman, but it's a challenge by these emotions and these thinking in a society that says you have every right to feel this way. So everybody else out there is telling them, not only do you have a right, but you should explore these feelings. Their deen, which they still believe in, says no. And their community that should be supporting them ostracizes them because of those feelings. Right? We need to really think about how we approach these things. Right? What's the punishment for dealing with riba? Punishment for riba is, what is it, 36 times. It's 36 times worse than the punishment for fornication. How many people do we know deal with riba and we don't treat them as bad as we treat someone who is fighting this sort of issue? We accept, we say, it's not hurting anybody. Astaghfirullah. We use the same arguments to justify why we deal with riba or why we accept others dealing with riba that we use against this particular issue. Allah has made it very clear. Riba is, nothing short of disbelief is worse than the dealing of riba and interest. And yet our response to that is nowhere near commensurate with our response to somebody, a Muslim, a brother or sister who's challenged by these sorts of emotions. That's hypocrisy. That's hypocrisy. I'm not even asking ourselves, how many times have we dealt with riba in the past? Astaghfirullah. Right? How accepting are we of people who have relationships outside of marriage? But when it comes to these, people who don't even act on these feelings, just because they feel this way, we ostracize and we deal with them in such a poor manner. And yet we accept our young people having boyfriends and girlfriends. Allah tells us you have to be just, even if it's against yourselves. Yeah? If we can't be just and merciful with each other, how are we going to ask Allah to be just and merciful with us? All right? So really think hard about how we as a community deal and respond to people within our own community who are dealing and struggling with these issues. We need professionals. We need knowledgeable people. We need imams who also have the psychological training to be able to help somebody in this situation deal with those issues. The last thing we want is to be the cause of somebody's disbelief or somebody taking their own life because we didn't support them in working their way through those issues. The last point before we open up the Q&A is around these issues that are happening in the schools. So we've heard of the Safe Schools programs and all these other stuff. And this is going to be a real challenge for us because this is an environment that we don't control. We don't control what occurs in schools. The first thing I'll say on those things is we shouldn't be scared of programs which promote tolerance, right? Two reasons. One, tolerance is actually a fundamental part of our deen. Yeah, right? Multiculturalism is not a Western concept, right? Multiculturalism was created as part of the deen. When the Prophet ﷺ migrated from Mecca to Medina, were the Muslims the majority? No, they actually weren't. There was only something like 60 or 70 Muslims at the time that he actually migrated. The majority were still non-Muslims and Jews. Look up, Google. Google's a great thing for something, right? Google the Charter of Medina. The very first documented constitution in history. And in that you will see multiculturalism. You'll see acceptance and tolerance of others. Yeah? So tolerance is not a bad thing on that point. Tolerance is our best friend in this society. We don't want a society that's intolerant. We already struggle to be accepted and to be given the space to practice our faith. The last thing we want is a society that pulls more and more away from tolerance. So we want to be encouraging tolerance and for our children to be tolerant. The challenge for us is identifying those parts of those programs which shift then from tolerance to acceptance. We don't accept that there are lifestyle choices that our children should be exposed to without our consent and without our knowledge and our involvement. And this is one of those areas. And we need to be strong enough to say, absolutely, we're 100% with you on the issue of tolerance, including tolerance for people in this category. However, this module over here which says, you know what, children should go experiment, sorry, we draw the line. Theologically, we draw the line. No, our children will not go and experiment. Right? How many children, when they grow up, like to take their clothes off? Happens all the time. I remember my kids always wanting to take their clothes off. What do parents do? They say, no, you know, it's not the right thing. I was going to say in Arabic, it's not wrong. That's how we teach our children modesty. Yeah, we put those limits around them. If you don't do that, what happens? It becomes acceptable. It becomes acceptable. So when they get older, it's nothing for them to take their clothes off. Right? No. So the things people are exposed to, what we allow our children to be exposed to, is something we have a right to have a say over. Yeah. So we need to take an active interest in what is happening in the school environment. You have every right, and there's nothing wrong with you saying, I want to see what you're putting in front of the children. I want to see the material. And these are not compulsory programs, right? They're voluntary programs for schools to take up, and they are voluntary programs for students to bring in. So have a look at it. And if there is and those parts of the program where they are encouraging children to dress in the way the other gender dresses, or they role play, right? So there are some programs now where children are encouraged to role play same-sex relationships, and how would they feel? We say no. Sorry, no. That's gone a step too far, right? Absolutely. 100% with you that everybody should accept people's choices, and they shouldn't be ostracized and discriminated against for those choices. However, we will not allow our children to be put in an environment where they then become the outsider because of the views that we hold. All right? We need to have these discussions with our children at the appropriate time in the appropriate manner. Right? As parents, we often struggle to talk about sexuality generally with our children. Right? Muslim parents are really uncomfortable generally around talking about intimacy with their children. We need to overcome that. Or if you can't, find somebody who you trust who can. Right? Whether it's in the madrasa, whether it's a family friend, whether it's a grandparent, somebody though needs to have the discussion with children around these issues of intimacy and sexual fluidity and what have you. If we don't, then their only source of information becomes what they hear outside, right? What they hear on the playground, what they get exposed to at school, what they see and hear on social media, on TV. It is normal now in movies, on TV, on social media for same-sex couples, not just to be in a relationship, but to then physically express that relationship, in movies and TV, what have you. And our children are exposed to those things. We need to lay the groundwork. Right? We can't outsource that part of parenting to schools, because that's not what they're going to do. Right? So one, we need to know what the position is. We need to know what the things we need to say to our children, and we need to have those discussions. Right? And we need to do it in the right way. Sex education is not haram in Islam. Yeah. Some things there is actually no haya in the deen. There's no modesty in the deen about some things. Right? Islam says it's a fard. It's an obligation on you to learn things at the time that you need to learn them. So when a child is approaching puberty, it's fard on the parents to start to teach them about those things. Right? If you don't, they're going to find it elsewhere. When our youth are reaching the age of marriage, it's fard on us to then go to the next level and explain the intimate parts of marriage in the right environment. Yeah, that's part of the deen. There are plenty of hadith where female Sahaba asked the Rasul very intimate questions. Well, there's no haya on those issues, because that's how people learn. Yeah, that's how people learn. And we either need to have structured environments where we do that, or parents, you've got to step up and start to do those things. So I guess the last message is, let's not be scared of what's happening. Let's be in control. right? Let's know what's going on, and we choose the things our children are exposed to, and we take some control back. I've given the time. I think I'll stop there and maybe open up to questions, comments, inshallah.
Jazakallah khair for that, Brother Krayem. I've been told to let you go by 5 o'clock, but I don't think that's going to happen. So I think we have time for 2 questions, if that's okay. Would anyone like to ask anything? Okay, one at the back. Anyone from the brothers, or? Okay.
We've got maybe 10 minutes. Yeah.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam.
Jazakallah khair, such an inspirational talk. Would you mind sharing with us your approach of discussing things like this with the young children? And I'm talking about primary school age. My son's in prep, but also, the older primary school at madrasah, for example. When they are exposed to this, obviously they are at a sponge age, where they just absorb everything from the environment, and they're trying to understand what's going on and take a stand, but they're still too young.
Yep.
And how do you approach that in a sensitive manner? And maybe share your experience as a child being in Australia, being exposed to a different things from your own culture or religion without actually having animosity towards them. Because they're not against the religions, but not accepting that it's right at the same time.
Inshallah. So I have 4 daughters. Right? So I have 4 girls. My daughters are aged 15. They'll kill me if I forget. 15, 18, 20, and 22. Yeah. They were all born here. They've grown up here. Let me answer the second part of that before I do the first part. So grow up for me. And this is an example of how Western societies change, and why we as Muslims say we should be governed by the divine rather than man's nafs and desires. When I was growing up, this wasn't an issue. When I was growing up, this wasn't an issue. It wasn't acceptable in Western society. Homosexuality still wasn't acceptable day to day in Western society when I was growing up, right? Nobody came out in high school that they were gay or homosexual or a lesbian, because society generally did not accept it. Obviously that leads to a whole range of other issues, but it wasn't an issue that my generation really had to deal with. Yeah, our issue growing up was just about having boyfriends and girlfriends. Why can't you go out with, so-and-so? Why can't you have a boyfriend or girlfriend? We didn't have to deal with this more complex issue of individual, sexual identity. So it's much harder, I think, for our children growing up. They're exposed to a far greater span of activity than we ever were, and social media, entertainment is a big part of that, right? What young people are exposed to, online, TV, songs, movies, is far worse now than it was when we were growing up. Far worse. So, from my perspective, how do you approach these issues generally with kids? The Rasul tells us raising children is in thirds. You got the first 7 years, then the next 7 years, and then the 7 years after that, right? The first 7 years, the focus is really around setting the wiring in the brain, right? The parameters of what they should and shouldn't do, and building the muhabba between the parent and the child. The next 7 years is where you start then to discipline the child in what the deen says, without having to explain the reasons why, right? It's where you start to introduce the child to salah, where you start to introduce the child to fasting, where you start to introduce girls to wearing the hijab, right? in a way which encourages them to do those things. When I say discipline, I don't mean punishment. I mean the disciplines of managing their nafs. Because by the time they reach 12, 13, 14, a lot of that groundwork is in place, right? I know lots of parents who left their kids to do whatever they wanted until they got to 14 and 15, and then started to try and put some boundaries in. It's too late. That horse is bolted. That's long gone, right? In those years, so that middle 7 years is where the example of the parents becomes really important. So how parents interact with each other is imprinted on the minds of those children. So when, and this is, I guess, leads into a separate issue, around domestic violence as well. The way in which parents talk, interact with each other, the respect they show each other, is what the children will pick up in that 7 years. If a father comes home after a hard day's work and takes it out on the family, that's what a young boy's going to pick up, right? Those middle 7 years are hugely important in determining how adult male and females will behave, right? In those years is where we need to start introducing them to the concepts around what Islam says about the interaction between gender, not about intimacy and things like that, right? Okay, yep, you're 7, 8, you now need to sit with the men when they gather, not with the women. Start to introduce the notions around, you can kiss your grandmother, but you can't go kiss the neighbour, even though you're only 8, 9 years old. I know it's hard, right? Because they still don't understand, right? But at some point you need to start that, right? You need to start to teach them about those things. And it comes across it earlier that you give them the information they need at that point in time. But as they start to get closer to puberty, you need to then start to having the discussions about what's happening with them physiologically, right? Their body's going to change. But it's not just that their body's going to change, right? That's not a hard conversation to have. Your body's going to change in this way, X, Y, and Z, right? But there are reasons why your body's changing. We need to have those discussions. And that's when you then also need to start saying, explaining what the Din says about why those changes happen, because Allah created us as a male and a female, as a dhakar and untha, because there's a purpose behind that, right? Just like your mother and father were a male and female, Allah says the family is made up of a mother and a father. You start to introduce those notions, sow those seeds. And so your body's changing because Allah's getting you ready. In 10 years' time, you're going to have a family of your own. This is what your body needs to do. So you sow the seeds. As they get a little bit older, you start to have discussions around things like what you're seeing on TV. You're seeing that, but that's haram in Islam. Right? That's haram. We don't do that. No, you can't. We don't have boyfriends or girlfriends, and we certainly don't have this sort of stuff. No, you can't watch that. Introduce these notions. By the time I'm having conversations with my 15-year-old that I didn't have with my eldest until she was much older. And if I had another child, I reckon I'd be having the same conversation with that child probably at 11 and 12 because of the exposure out there. Right? So by the time they've reached puberty, you need to be in a position where they actually understand what it means to be a male and a female. And then you can have the conversation, in Islam, Allah has created everything in balance, right? And He's created male and female because we balance each other out. A male and a male doesn't work. Female and female doesn't work in the overall scheme of things. These things are haram. People out there, they're not Muslims. They can do what they want. Our Deen says we've got to do it this way. So I think it's just something you need to introduce gradually and be able to have that conversation with the children. And each child's going to be different depending on their personality. I don't think there's a one rule fits all. Some you're going to find it easy to do with, others you're going to find it much harder to do with. I don't know if that helps much.
Jazakallah khair. Do we have time for one more?
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
Okay. Anyone else have an opinion? Great.
Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum assalam.
I got a quick question. It's connection of a couple points, so hopefully makes sense.
Inshallah.
So you mentioned about the child education between first 7 years. So the first 7 years, second 7 years, and so on. Now, the current education system right now, child starts schools at 5.
Yep.
Right? And somehow it builds a schema where we as parents having less time with our kids. So I was thinking that it might affect the fact that they might lead to different ways. So that's one point. The second point is I myself prefer to start at 7, but the situation doesn't. I don't know. What's your opinion about this? Does my question make sense?
I think so. I think so.
Sorry, I can't explain.
Look, and nobody, please, nobody be offended by what I'm going to say. I'm as guilty of this as anybody else. We have to step up as parents. I know time is short. I know we're really busy, and we get much busier. But you can't expect, if you've only got 2 or 3 hours of an evening because you do a long day, some parents unfortunately have to do, 6 to 6, for example. That's a really long day. You come home really tired. You've got young kids, you've only got a couple of hours with them. You just want to sit down and relax. You know what? You can't. I know it sounds really harsh, but you can't. You will never get that time back with children of that age. You'll never get it back. And like I said, please, nobody be offended. I know what I'm saying is going to sound like, wishful thinking, right? And it takes both parents, right? It's not something the mother can do on their own, and it's certainly not something the father can do on their own, because generally, well, I shouldn't say that anymore, because these days it's usually probably both parents are working, and the children come home. And they might be with family, might be with grandparents for a little bit, and you both come home. Make the most of those hours. Think about where you are putting your time when you are home. In front of the TV, relaxing. On Facebook, on social media, because I'm as guilty of it now as my children are. Right. So we have a rule now in our house: no devices on the dinner table. So 2 rules. We absolutely eat together, right? So if we are home, we don't allow the children to take their food and eat on their own. We sit together and eat, because it might be the only time now that we, as a family, actually have a discussion. And what we find is once we do that, the girls will keep going. We'll talk for hours. But if we let them go, we won't see them for hours. And no devices when we're sitting together. Think of those little things, and I know if you're talking about little children, it's a different story. But even with little children, take them with you. If you go to the mosque, take them with you, right? I get really frustrated by imams who challenge the sort of noise we're hearing outside. I say, alhamdulillah. SubhanAllah, I love to hear the noise of children in the masjid because it gets them comfortable with the environment. I'd much rather them hear than sitting at home in front of the TV or on an iPad. So if you go into the masjid to pray, obviously you're going mindful of others but take them with you. If you go into a gathering, a community gathering, take them with you. Try to get them into as many environments which we feel comfortable with as possible, right? So that they start to associate happiness, good times with those sorts of environments than with other environments. Because if we don't take them, their happiest moments are going to be where? They're going to be at school with their friends doing things which in 2 or 3 years' time, we're going to be thinking, hang on a minute, no, I don't want you to do that, right? I don't allow my children to go by themselves to a shopping centre at all. At all. And I said my eldest child is 22, right? My girls are not allowed to go to a shopping centre by themselves for any reason, right? And the reason I do that, and I know it sounds harsh, the reason I do that is at some point in the society that we're in, girls now, girls generally are being encouraged to do things on their own. Islam is very clear about what you can and can't do with and without a mahram. So if I haven't started getting my girls used to the idea that without a mahram, and the only mahram they have in Melbourne is me, by the way, we have no other family. If I haven't got them used to the idea that they can't do certain things without a mahram, then I'm going to struggle to get them to look at the bigger picture when it comes up. Whereas now they self-regulate, right? So my kids started off doing Islamic schools, and then they went to public schools. So, you know, my 20-year-old and my 18-year-old went to state schools. They don't come home asking, can we go to a party? Can we go to the centre with our friends? Because they know what the answer is. They know what the answer is. They know what my answer is going to be, and they know the reason why. But if they want to go, I will not say to them, no, we can't go. I will go. I can't tell you how many chick flicks I've watched because I don't want to deprive my children of everything. So if I've placed a rule on them that says you can't go by yourself, well then I'm going to go with them, right? There are some movies which I will watch first, even now, because I won't allow them to watch it if I don't know exactly what is going to be shown on the screen. And they laugh at me sometimes. They say, oh, that's just PG. So yeah, that's all right. No, I'll watch it twice. Parents have to sacrifice some things. And the sooner you start that sort of thing, the easier it becomes. That's my view. We struggle most when our children come home and say, our children, when they were in Islamic schools, when they would come home and say, but my friends are doing X, Y, and Z. Other Muslim families doing X, Y, and Z. We don't struggle with the non-Muslim families because they know that Muslims don't do this. But when other Muslim children are doing certain things and we're saying to them, no, 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 that's a much harder conversation. Because then you're having to say, well, look, maybe their parents don't know, you know, it's a much harder conversation to have. So, you know, obviously, I think the sooner you can, the better, and just keep, you know, stay with them. You know, that middle 7 years is a really important years to build that relationship so that in the next 7, they're doing things because they respect the knowledge you gave them, not because they're scared of the way you will react to something. Inshallah, that answered the question. It's probably...
Okay, Jazakallah khair once again, Brother Ghaith.
Yeah.
So that ends the program for right now. I think we're going to all take some of the points I thought were very fabulous for us to drive ourselves individually and as a community, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So inshallah. Would you like to end with a dua or? Okay, or maybe? Yeah.
Can
Membuat doa.
Maybe I'll just finish with this. It's not so much a dua. The Prophet ﷺ said to us, he tells us, Islam started off gharib, strange, and is going to end up strange. May Allah make us of the strangers. And he said, there will come a time when Islam, when holding on to your iman is going to be like holding hot coals. We're there. Every day is becoming stranger and stranger to be a Muslim who is true to their deen. Yeah? And holding on to the faith. And we make dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us of those ghuraba, those strangers, and, you know, to put some heat-resistant mittens on our hands so that we can hold onto the deen in the challenging times to come, inshallah.
Jazakallah khair once again. Hope you guys all enjoyed that and took something from it. And I don't know what's next in the program, but we'll start that soon, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi. Thank you.